My name is Sabaah Folayan. I am a filmmaker, an artist, a storyteller, and an advocate for marginalized and oppressed people. Yeah, so in September, no, on August 9th of 2014, Michael Brown Jr., an 18-year-old unarmed kid in St. Louis, was gunned down by a police officer, and his body was left in the street for 4.5 hours. And the community came out, wondering what had happened, wanting answers about what had happened, and the police responded with extreme force. And this led to months of sustained protests in the streets and extreme militarization. The National Guard was called in, a state of emergency was declared, and it was a major spark for what became a global Black Lives Matter movement. So, the documentary Whose Streets chronicles the lives of the activists who took part in this movement. I got to Ferguson about a month after Mike Brown was killed, and we connected with a lot of the people who were keeping the protests going. And we wanted to take a deeper look at what was happening, to go beyond just the buzzwords and the political conversation and get to the real human stories behind the issue. I was inspired to make the film um, because of the first interview that we did. I initially went to try to do a public health study because I was a pre-med student at the time, and I wanted to show that people and police facing off was going to have a long-term traumatic effect on this community. So I had typed up these questionnaires to ask people about their mood and their mental state. And I realized once I got there that you couldn't do those type of interviews in that kind of environment. There was just too much going on. So I was with my director of photography, Lucas Alvarado Farrar, and he was recording, and I started asking questions. And after the very first interview that we did, we realized that we needed to keep coming back, keep telling these stories, and create a different narrative, because the narrative that the media had been putting forward was very dehumanizing to the Black people involved in the situation. It was very much about criminalizing the protesters as thugs. It focused on the property damage and ignored the loss of life and ignored the long-term systemic issues that had led to this moment. So we wanted to come in and offer a different perspective. It was very intense to be there when all this was happening, because I had been kind of insulated from that type of overt and violent racism because I was born in Los Angeles. I went to school in New York. And so I was experiencing a sort of liberal racism. And I was also receiving a lot of the privileges that come from being educated in elite white spaces. And so I did experience racism. I did experience microaggressions. But going to St. Louis and seeing how racism can be life and death, and how it can be so violent and so polarized, I realized that we as a country, the United States, is not as far along as we may have thought we were, as we may have claimed to be. And it really challenged me to become more active and more centered in my stance, and to make sure that when I was moving through privileged spaces, that I was still representing for the people who are still facing overt everyday racism and the poverty and the violence and the repression that comes with that. I just tried to build normal, respectful relationships. Because I wasn't a filmmaker by trade, I came as a human being. I tried to be really transparent about why I was there and what I wanted to do. And first and foremost, I really wanted to use the film as an opportunity to show people that what they were doing mattered. A lot of times, activism is really thankless work. There's no guarantee that the system is going to change. It's traumatic to go out every day and face off with the police, and then to turn on the news and see a story about yourself that completely denies the truth and completely vilifies you as an activist and makes it seem like the police are completely normal and beyond reproach. It's difficult. So I felt like by interviewing people, I could just give them an opportunity to feel like somebody cared about their story, that it mattered to someone. And by making this film, we could ensure that the real version of what happened got out there and that no one was able to forget what had taken place in St. Louis. How do you activist? An activist is just someone who takes an active role in their world, in their life. Anybody can be an activist. You don't have to quit your job to be an activist. It's just about the way you move through the world. It's about calling out injustice whenever you see it. It's about being willing to make sacrifices, personal sacrifices, professional sacrifices in order to do what's right. It's about being honest about the ways in which you might benefit from exploitation, because we all do. Um, it's just about being engaged and remembering that we do have power, that just because things may have been bad for a long time doesn't mean that they can't change, and it doesn't mean that we can relieve ourselves of responsibility to try to make change. So I think that an activist is just someone who is active, and you can do that in any profession, in any role, at any age, in any place in your life. To people who feel like giving up or feel like there's no way out, I would just say, for me, connecting with nature is what keeps me sane, and just remembering how miraculous it is that we can even exist, that out of the same matter, the same material that makes a plant or a table or a chair, when you put it together in a certain way, you can be a human being, and we can have emotions and thoughts and feelings and love one another. I mean, it's really just a miracle just to be here. And so when I'm tired, I just remember the fact that so many people fought and died just so that I could be here. And I just, go for a walk, just let myself off the hook sometimes. It's not always every day that we can be in the fight. It's not always every day that we have something to offer, and that's okay. It's okay to celebrate life. And also, for all the people who have passed away, I feel like it's our responsibility to enjoy every second of life that we have for those who can't. So sometimes I think we give ourselves too much pressure that it's our job to change everything. If we're not doing work, we're not doing anything. We also have to remember that we are the celebration of our ancestors. We're the dreams of our ancestors. We're the proof of how hard they worked, and we're the proof that resistance does work, because we wouldn't be here if they didn't resist. And, I also say we'll never know in our lifetime the sum of our work and the impact that it'll have. We'll never live long enough to be able to measure the overall score of things. So it's not our responsibility to figure it out. It's not our responsibility to solve everything. We just have to do what we're able to do and what's put in our path to do, and just, sort of let go of the rest. And I know that can be really difficult, because when you empathize and you see so much struggling and so much suffering, you want to help and you want to fix everything. But we have to remember that, it's bigger than us, and it's not our fault that things are like this. And we may not see what the future looks like. We may not see what the solution looks like, but we have to just sort of keep walking. Taking care of yourself is really important. I think it starts with paying attention to your body, because this is very intellectual and mental work. And a lot of times we forget to pay attention to our physical body. And our body is what tells us how we're doing. If we're upset, we have a feeling in our stomach. We may feel anxiety. We may feel tension in our shoulders. And so for me, it's about really being in tune with that, doing yoga, putting the right food in my body, exercising, on an emotional level, paying attention to what's triggering to me, to what makes me feel good, paying attention to what state I'm in, and do I have the capacity to do something that day or that minute or that hour, or do I need to step back? And remembering that this fight is bigger than me. It's not up to me as an individual to try to save the world, to try to save everybody. I can only do what's in my power, and I can't bring more to a movement than I'm bringing to myself. So in a way, you have to be a little bit selfish, because if not, you run yourself down, and then you break down and you have nothing else to offer, or you become the person that needs help rather than being able to help others, which, there's nothing wrong with needing help. I also want to stress that it's important to ask for help when you need it, but it's also our responsibility to take care of ourselves to the best of our ability, so that we can be there to lend a hand to other people. So the hashtag Black Lives Matter, from what I understand, started when Trayvon Martin was killed And after Trayvon Martin was killed, there were a few more people. There was a big protest in Florida, and they, locked down the Capitol. And I think that was the beginning of an awakening. And Barack Obama said, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. And I think it emboldened a lot of people so that by the time Michael Brown Jr. was killed, I think people were just frustrated and they were alert and they were fed up. And I think that's part of why Michael Brown Jr.'s death was such a spark. And also, people of St. Louis are just a really different and special breed of people who are very, I think, naturally disposed to being engaged and being direct and being straightforward. So when this happened in their backyard, it was a different kind of response. I don't think people were really ready for that kind of response. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it happened in St. Louis, because Missouri and St. Louis has always been a battleground in the United States. We had what was called the Missouri Compromise, which was basically like Missouri was the most northern state that was still allowed to keep the slaves that they already had because they were holding so tight to those southern values. So it's always been a battleground, and there's a lot of pain in the land. There's a lot that's been done to the indigenous people there, and you go there and you can just feel the energy. And I think that is what kind of gave breath and life to the Black Lives Matter hashtag, which I think had been a great idea, but didn't really take root until the people of Ferguson decided that they had had enough. I think social media is a great tool for communication. It allows us to really rapidly spread ideologies. It allows us to have really important conversation across geographic boundaries. I think it's a huge reason why we've gained an awareness that our situation is global and not just local. I think that for people who live in segregated societies, which is most of us, and for Black people in the Northern Hemisphere, where we tend to be a numerical minority, having social media is really important to building up that sense of strength in numbers and building up that sense of connection, because we don't feel as isolated in these small pockets. But I also think that social media has its limitations. It cannot do everything. It is simply a new form of communication and sharing information. But sharing information is not the only element of a social movement. And so I think that because things can go viral and because we can reach so far, sometimes we feel like social media can be a solution, but it still takes that legwork, it still takes that local work, it still takes building real in-person relationships to sustain a movement.